Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Vintage Books Live. I'm Christy Peterson from Vintage Books, and tonight we have Laura Stanfill, who is the author of Singing Lessons with the for the Stylish Canary. She's got her copy here. I have my copy here. Yay! Um, and Laura, I love your background. By the way, love having the. That's not a serenade though in the background. I don't think.
There's a serenade over
Oh, that one is. I meant the other side.
There's the Wurlitzer jukebox over there.
Yeah, exactly. So usually we start off these interviews with kind of the same question for everybody. And that is, how did you get here? Where did the story start and how did it go on its way to becoming an actual story?
Well, the answer is 15 years in the making. And I wanted to write about music boxes and mechanical music collectors. I grew up with a family that was very into music boxes. And as a little kid, I would go to conferences and sit in the back of the room while everybody discussed cylinder boxes or barrel organs or jukeboxes. And I was really interested in diving into that world of my parents as a writer, trying to understand what is important about music that's outdated or vintage or nostalgic, why they love this. And along that route, I discovered an instrument called the Serenade. It was used to train canaries how to sing popular songs. There's one here in the background. And I fell in love with the idea of this canary tuning music box. And suddenly I found myself shuttled down a rabbit hole of research and writing historical fantasy, as it turns out. So it came up, it started from lived experience. It moved into falling in love with this one instrument and being really curious about why people would train canaries. And then 15 years later, here's a book.
Yay. So tell us a little bit about the Serenade. I know from watching your social media and seeing, that you were going to get one and then it was all very exciting. But I actually don't know very much about them. I know that they are also called barrel organs. So I'm assuming that they involve something that turns, but that's all I really.
So yeah, a barrel organ is basically a type of music box, but instead of a regular music box, it has bellows in it, and I will show you those. So my Serenade has panels you can remove, and you can see they're very sort of old and not polished. They're not particularly fancy because this is an old instrument, but you can look in and see the bellows. This got restored. The leather was really old and cracked, and here's the crank. And here's the worm gear. The worm gear turns the barrel. And as pins touch these little dubers here, I don't know their official name, the pipes, the tin pipes in the back open up and play a note. And so
interesting. It's almost like a version of those little things that you get when you're a kid with the little plastic little records that but with pipes too. It's really interesting. It's like a cross between an organ and one of those little crank instruments that they tink, whenever they go across a bump, they would pluck a piece of metal or something, but it's not because it's got the music, like the pipes in the background. That's super cool.
So yeah, I wanted to show that because that panel also comes off. They're tin pipes. They're not very fancy. When this instrument came into my possession, the person who restored it found out that the pipes had been installed and restored backwards. Oh, no. So the music didn't sound like anything when we first got it. And the restorer had long conversations with a mechanical music person in Switzerland who had known of serenades. And they figured out that the pipes had been turned upside down and reversed. And so I think it was a painstaking process, and he had to cut some of the pipes down a little bit to fit them back in. So
Oh, that's very cool. So what
how it works, I can try to play a little bit, but I haven't historically had a good reception on Zoom. Like people can't seem to hear it very well, but I can try if you'd like.
Sure.
I'll play a little bit, and you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. And this is pretty awesome. I'm trying to do it so that you can see it. All right. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. If I don't get a thumbs up, I'll stop pretty quick. But this should be, I believe, Oh Susanna. Did you hear
Barely,
it?
barely. I mean, I
Yeah,
can hear it. This tiny little peeping noise, and it's really interesting because it does sound like a bird. It's like that. The pitch of it is really like a bird singing. That's really interesting.
It
So
does. I
when
can
was
put
the
an actual, yeah.
what was the because you did all the historical research, what was the like what sparked this interest in teaching canaries how to sing? Because I know you talked about stuff in the book, but I don't remember there being, like, obviously there wouldn't be a long historical, section in the book because that would sort of ruin the story. But so did some famous person decide that, oh, let's teach canaries how to sing, or like what started the fad? Do you know?
I don't know what started it. I could not find a lot in my research about either the invention of the serenade or this fad, this mania about training your birds. But I do know back in the day, if you couldn't play an instrument, one way to have music in your house was to have a music box. And so for sure, I feel like this canary training obsession came out of that wanting to have music in your house. And serenettes, they aren't really, I mean, they're joyful and they're fun to listen to, but they're not like pleasing, gentle, gorgeous music that like a music box that you would think. They're definitely a lot more like in your face sound and bright birdsong sound. But for whatever reason, people wanted to train their canaries, and so this became how. Originally, there was a clarinet-shaped device called a flageolet, and it was played kind of like this, like a clarinet. And it also was pitched really high, like a piccolo. And people who wanted to train their canaries before the serenade would play the flageolet to the birds, and then the birds supposedly would learn the music. And so the serenade meant that anybody could do it.
Right. I was going to say, but you had to know how to play the instrument, whereas the serenade, you didn't really have to know. That's really interesting.
You just crank it. So women in New England wanted, often were the people who bought serenettes, and they wanted their canaries to learn how to sing popular songs for the entertainment factor, but also because canary contests were a thing. And so if you had a canary that had the brightest plumage or had the most beautiful voice, it said something to your village or your town about you, like you were a good person because your canary won this award. And so that was the social impetus for training birds.
I just think that's really fascinating, that like the whole human like competition and the whatever, it's like the best jam at the county fair or something. Like it's like there's always something in our culture that has that little, the competition factor and the fads and everything, and that's really fun. I was really curious in the book also because there's a really, really powerful like metaphors in the weather in the book, it felt like, and I was wondering if how that evolved in your mind as you were writing it.
It's not something I started out with, but when I realized that it would have been a very dreary life to build these boxes over and over again, I mean, they're pretty plain, they're pretty you can see the restorer's information on the back, but there are no bells and whistles in a serenade.
Yeah.
It's just the same pins and staples going into the barrel over and over again. And it was probably a very hard life living in a small town, making mechanical music instruments to export. And so I wanted to write a whimsical, historical, fabulous, joyful book, because Canaries and the way the serenade sounds, it's this cheerful, happy sound. But the people who actually lived in the original village of Mirecourt probably had hard lives. And so to honor what I was doing in fiction and how I wanted to talk about canaries and finding your own voice as a human being, I decided I needed to fictionalize the town a little bit. And the first thing that happened, and it really just happened on the page, was that the weather became kind of magical. And when my protagonist's father's born, the sun comes out, and then it's sunny all the time. And before it was rainy all the time. And so that I definitely use that as a metaphor and play with it a lot throughout the book. And also, of course, there's like a hey, elbowing about climate change for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting is the contrast between like the idea of the organ, it's not really a factory, but the workshop, and the lace making, and the contrast between those two I thought was really interesting. And I'm assuming the lace making was that also a thing in that town historically?
Yeah, this little town on the German border, Mirecourt, was known for serenades, violins, and bobbin lace. And the particular type of lace they made was a coarse household lace, like think tablecloths or edgings of curtains. It wasn't delicate, beautiful lace. It was coarse. I mean, so probably, I mean, I went to visit bobbin lace makers to learn more about how the women in my book would have been moving their hands, but I also imagine that the thread was quite coarse compared to the delicate doily making types of lace in other places,
like you think of with Belgian lace or something, where it's
exactly
really, yeah, okay. I just thought that was really interesting because there's there still though is an intricacy in the lace making process that isn't as there really in this. I mean, the serenette's pretty straightforward, you're putting the pins in, like you said, the wood's really pretty simple, and then but the lace making is very intricate. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it can be very intricate. One of the things that comes up just briefly in the book, but I thought it was really interesting, is the women who are the lace makers, even the top lace makers, are not allowed to make the patterns. Men would make the patterns. And to me, that's yet another way to unpack and peel through the layers of gender and what people's expected roles were in society. So even the women who are teaching other young women how to make lace are not the ones who are defining the pattern or deciding on the pattern. It's a man.
And I mean, you said that you made a comment about layers, and that was actually kind of leads me into my next question, because there are so many layers. I mean, it's really, in some ways it is light and magical, and you get that vibe of the canary singing, the cute little sounds that birds make. But there's a lot of like layers of patriarchy and not being able to be who you want to be and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just curious what you when you think about somebody reading this book, what do you want them to take away from the reading experience? Like, I know that we don't dictate to readers like you have to get this out of the book or you have to get that out of the book, but when you think about somebody reading it, I think, what kind of would you hope that is the most interesting message that somebody would take away from it?
Well, it's because I wrote it for 15 years. I changed so much over that time and grew into myself. And I think that's part of why the layers are there. And for sure, there are social messages about who we're supposed to be versus who we want to become. And so I would say the message of becoming and acknowledging who we are inside, that matters as much or more as what society says we should be. I would hope people would take that away, but also hope. It's very much a book of hope. And I think in these times, seeing characters break out of their expected roles and forge new paths is an apt metaphor for coming out of a pandemic very slowly. We're still in it, but getting through it and looking around and deciding what we want our lives to look like, what we want our houses to look like, what we want friendships to look like. I just feel like we have a lot of opportunity, and there's some hope in that opportunity. And I would like readers to find that hope and joy also, even if it's just purely on an escapist level.
Yeah, well, that again leads into something else that I was thinking about, that I think about this a lot, particularly now that I'm in the bookstore. So I'm seeing all kinds of books come through, and thinking a lot about about the question of what makes something literary fiction versus not literary fiction. And I think that we have there's a little bit of snobbery that creeps into that question, but I'm curious what that means to you when you think of literary fiction versus maybe commercial fiction. What distinguishes the two in your mind?
That's a great question, and something that I've grappled with as the publisher of Forest Avenue Press, because when I started, I wanted to publish quiet novels about characters, interiorly focused books, where maybe the exterior storyline isn't moving all that fast, but the internal shifts are really beautiful and really important, and where language plays a huge role. And about 2 years after, Forest Ave is 10 years old this year, and about 2 years into it, I started picking novels that had more energy, external energy to them, and were more on that commercial literary border. And since then, I've morphed into really loving books that have genre aspects to them. But fundamentally, I think everything that I've published and what I write also falls into the literary category. It's like literary and, right? It's not. I mean, not that there's such thing as just literary, but I feel like language matters in all the books that I've published and in my book. And I think that's what literary originally stood for. And in my head, in my heart, as a publisher and a writer, it still stands for someone who takes care of their language, takes care of their sentences, and through that takes care of the reader. But for sure, this book, I've called it historical, I've called it literary, I've called it literary set in the 19th century. And Publishers Weekly, and there's this fantastical element as well. Publishers Weekly called it fantasy light, L-I-T-E. And I was like, is that like a fantasy on a diet or something? But it's rather apt, because
that's really interesting, because I don't think I would call it that at all. But I do think that there are really interesting aspects of, I guess in my mind, I do think that literary becomes a lot like other things in our lives, where we say we know it when we see it, because it's very nebulous. And I definitely think this book is literary, but it just has some of the, I don't know, there was some of the light and the joy that sometimes I don't see in literary fiction. A lot of times I think literary fiction, people feel like it has to be real serious, and it has to be depressing, and it has to address these very serious issues of, and I think I personally a lot of times have steered away from reading literary fiction, because I'm like, I do not want to be depressed. And I did not have that experience reading this book. And so that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I think it's just an interesting question, how we decide that something is or isn't a literary work. And so it was really fun to think about how this book fits into there, and how it sort of straddles the line in some ways and not in others. So
my friend Grace asked me at another recent event about the serious novel, and I would put that in the same category as literary. Often what we think of as the serious novel is focused on male characters, or it could be very depressing, like a serious novel that has a lot of those weighty subjects. And at the same time, I would say this book to me is serious because I spent 15 years on it, but there's a lightness to it also, and a humor to it that isn't.
It's very interesting. My kids have asked the question, Mom, why doesn't funny get considered literary? And so we, in our house, we've had conversations about this, and I think that's why I just enjoyed this so much, is that I do think it's literary, but it's definitely there's just so much lightness and hope in it that it was not the usual sort of like, oh my gosh, this is going to end badly and I'm going to be sad.
Yeah.
I just finished another one, and I won't say what it was, but I just finished another book where it was very literary, and it was wonderful, and it was powerful, and it was well written, and it ended very sadly.
Yeah.
You're just like, what is this?
I feel like my sad tolerance is very low right now after the pandemic and the losses I've personally experienced. Anything sad is like too far over the level of sad for me right now.
I have found that affecting my reading choices and television choices, like all kinds of different things where it's just like,
I'm finding myself reading more genre as a result.
Yeah. So I'm really pleased that you all could join us tonight. I am going to open it up for questions. Reminder that we're recording, but you are welcome to turn on your camera and mic if you would like to ask a question live. The other alternative is you are welcome to type a message into chat and I can read it out. And so whichever one is more comfortable for you is completely fine. And while yay, Nancy, hi.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask Laura, given that I know that you had a career in news reporting and editing before you started Forest Avenue and joined the writing groups that you've been in Portland, and, just become such an amazing inspiration for so many people in the Portland area who write and just love to read. Okay, my question is, how did being in journalism influence the writing of singing lessons, if it did?
That's a great question, Nancy, fellow newsroom pal from the old days. Journalism really impacted my first two novels. I think in terms of how I was reporting the story, getting it down on the page, it was still my language, and my language has always been a little whimsical and over the top, but I feel like I was really trying to lean in and report on these characters in some way. Especially I had these two novels that didn't sell, and the second one was set in a newsroom, and so for sure the language of the newsroom is on the page, and I felt like as my character was going through and figuring out the stories she was reporting on, I was hearing it in my head like it was reported to me almost. But singing lessons, I just broke through all of that and became a lot more playful.
Yeah, definitely. I can feel that for sure. I just wondered if when you were kind of taking the deep dives into your characters, if any of it felt a little bit like reportage, in the sense that, you were, I like that phrase, leaning in. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it sounds like kind of came from a different part of your heart.
And I would say that the dialogue, every piece of dialogue I write is always inspired by all the years I spent listening to other people.
For sure. Thank
And
you.
I changed cadences here because it's historical and it's set in France, but that training is always there when I write a piece of dialogue.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions?
Yes, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, Laura. This is Kristen, and I don't have a camera, sorry. I just got to the point where the neurodivergent character has been introduced. I forget his name. It started with an O. And I was curious if that was a conscious choice to include that kind of character, or if because neurodivergence is part of your world, if he just kind of organically appeared.
That's a great question. He organically appeared, and I adjusted him a few times over the writing. In fact, he used to be a woman. I sort of feel like every character in the book is me to some degree. Maybe not Guillaume, the older brother, because he's kind of mean. But but everybody else, I feel like, is connected to me in some way. And Odile is very neurodivergent and very much a version of me that most people don't ever get to see. I just kind of hide that part of me away. But it felt important to have somebody who is neurodivergent. I mean, I think all my characters are to some degree. I don't know how to write normal.
I love it.
But Odile in particular has a marked neurodivergence that other people can see and feel. And, you know, I was writing about that part of myself. And for sure, I have neurodivergent folks in my family. And I wanted to honor that representation because it wasn't really something that was probably talked about in a positive way, if at all, back in the day when this book.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen.
All right. Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the feminist thread through your book, which I love, and I'm trying to ask, like, so I'm wondering when that became a part of what the story was that you were trying to tell. Because being in writing group with you and, you know, going through the book in so many early incarnations, and I've been trying to remember those sentiments and where they were in the sort of course of, you know, the creation of the book. And it seems like the prevalence of that, like how much that is in the how important it is to the novel, is something that came a little later. Anyway, I don't know if you know what the question is that I'm trying to ask, but if you do, talk about it.
That's great. I feel like there were always strong women characters in the book, and I knew Henri, my protagonist, was different. And I knew that that was going to be a rub with the men in his family. Early on, he had an older brother who lived with him, and there was a lot of comparison that was happening between Jean-Jacques, the missing older brother that I axed, and Henri, who is the younger one. But I always saw Henri's way out of what the expectations were. What, you know, to use the Serenette and Canary metaphors, Henri's way out of the cage that was built for him before he was born was through the women in his life. And so in my head, that was always there. And I think his mom and his grandma were on the page fairly early. But then I struggled for a long time about how to make that theme sing, so to speak. I didn't know how to do it besides having the women on the page. And for a while I would have random women would pop up and have their own paragraph, because I wanted to get the sense of this fabric of female and community. and that didn't really work. So I definitely massaged the concept a whole lot until it became what I wanted it to be. But in my head, it's always been the women around Henri who help him find his way.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when Ame arrived on the scene, how early she was a part of it, you know?
She was a part of it early on, but she wasn't as important as she is in the final book. She was a friend that he gravitated toward because she was strong and fierce in ways that he didn't know how to be. And she was really a walk-on character until the Tucson Festival of Books in 2017 or maybe 2018. And I was writing pages of notes, thinking about the book, writing a back cover, jacket copy paragraph to figure out how I was going to revise this time. And I called her a tomboy, and I was like, oh yeah, she's all masculine in ways that we would attribute, that back in the day that they would have considered not appropriate for a young girl to act that way. And because I had been playing with gender all along, it made an obvious leap to having Ame be stronger and smarter than Henri in a lot of ways, and more socially savvy for sure.
So I'm going to have to jump in. Unfortunately, I love this conversation, but we have a 40-minute time limit and we only have about a minute and a half left. So I just wanted to say thank you, Laura, so much for joining us. And I'm super pleased that you could be here and bring your Serenette and your book. And one last really quick question for our last minute is that, do you have any other projects that you're working on that we might see in the future? And if anything you can say about them, but I know if they're early on, you probably can't yet.
Sure. I have two projects that are early on, and they're sort of like the horses. They're both moving forward at the same pace. And I don't know which one is going to overtake the other one in terms of my time. But I also have a finished novel set in the 1920s, and it's about a different facet of the music business. And I got notes on Saturday from my agent on it. Yay! So I'm in revision now. So
awesome. Well, we'll look for that. And that's very exciting. And it's going to cut me off here. So I'm going to say good night. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vintage Books. Thank you.
Thank you.